Welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. I am Douglas Peak, and I am your Salty Pastor. I'm here to coach you up in your faith, and it is so good to be back with you in studio here on the soil of America, the land that I love. Had a really great trip, went over to Scotland and spent 2 weeks over there and learned a lot of things. And it's really unique to see how the Scottish people and their culture influenced the birth of America in so many ways. So big shout out to the Scots and their contributions to who we are as a nation and country today. Also, the depth of commitment to faith that they had for centuries. It's absolutely unbelievable. And if you ever get an opportunity to dig into the Scottish Reformation and John Knox, I encourage you to do so because it was a phenomenal example of committed faith. And I did talk about in my podcast from England a little bit. I didn't get to dig into it that much, but I wanted to. But that was in Iona. I talked about it in my email. In Iona, it's a small island, but that's the first island on which a missionary, many people think from Ireland, sailed over and started the first Christian settlement or abbey there. And that's how Christianity was introduced to Scotland, and from there, that was a gateway through which it spread. And what's really interesting about it is the person who went and started it, St. Columba, what was really interesting to it is that his entire commitment on this small island was the ministry of the word. And that's right. It was to maintain the scriptures, teach the scriptures, have people learn how to read the scriptures. And so that's what he spent his entire life, was dedicated to what he called the ministry of the word, which really resonates with me because it just shows how even very early on, I mean, this is in the 500s, like 583, somewhere in there, how significant Christianity was in the development of the rational mind along with faith. They saw the reasoning and rationality and truth, objective truth, as a core tenet of the Christian faith. So it wasn't about dogma, it was about objective truth revealed in the personhood of Jesus Christ. Now, I did talk about on my Tuesday podcast about the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And so I want to dig deeper today, and I want us to really ask some great questions, okay? Because I think it's really important to ask really good questions when we have to deal with these tragic things. On one level, you're dealing with it emotionally, right? I mean, my goodness, it's just so heart-wrenching, and it's just so emotional, so evil, and it's so wrong. And boy, you just want to, grab your sword and run out there. And I totally get that. I feel that way in a lot of ways. But the real issue is asking ourselves, how do we, if you want to be a follower of Christ, respond to these events? And more importantly, how do you respond to the ideology that produced these kinds of results? And I think that's really what Christians should challenge themselves to do. And that is this. First of all, everybody condemns, it's a heinous act. It's a heinous act. And of course, you have people who politically want to take guns away from everybody. They blame the gun. They say, well, the gun is what caused the problem. Well, the difficulty with this argument was up until 1970, even here in Idaho, I was talking to a man who's an elder in our church, and when he went to high school here, and he said the teachers used to ask you to bring your gun to school so that after school you could go out and put down a rabid dog or get rid of some of the marmots out in the back, by the school. So there were no school shootings back then. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, guns were prolific back there in the 50s and the 60s, and there were no gun shootings. What's changed? Well, the culture's changed. And there's ideologies in our culture today that are producing these results. And it's a very important question to ask. It's a fair question to ask, and it's the right question to ask. How do you know what ideology produced this result, and how do you respond to it? So the first question the first answer to the question is this, is we need to identify what ideology we're talking about. If you look back over the last year and a half, and you look at all the school shootings and various things, they were against religious schools. The one in Minnesota was against a Catholic school. The one, I believe, is outside Nashville was against a Christian school. And so these places have become targets. The one thing that was in common by all of these people who propagated these heinous acts had been steeped in trans ideology, which, by the way, just for clarification, is different than gay and lesbian ideology, okay? Trans ideology, queer ideology is steeped in cultural Marxism. That's right. It's a specific ideology that started at Columbia University in the late 1930s. It was titled the Frankfurt School of Social Theory. Today we call it woke. And some people say, well, that's woke. And in a lot of ways, people are like, well, it sounds woke, it looks woke, so it must be woke. And so now woke has become kind of a category for all of this craziness, that's going on. But let's get specific. What does it mean to be woke? Well, first and foremost, it means to be progressive. That's right. It also has at its core atheism. There is a scientific materialism, secular humanist bent to it. And it is very much wrapped around Karl Marx's definition of what it means to be a human being. And Marcuse, who was a philosopher at Columbia, extensively wrote on these types of topics. And he's kind of the father of this Frankfurt School of Social Theory. The other thing that I think is really important to understand is that at its core, it is totalitarian. Now, what does totalitarian mean? Well, totalitarianism is about control of thought through the dehumanization of the individual. In totalitarian regimes, you want people to be loyal to the state, not to any other ideology, belief system, family, relatives, or anything else. Consequently, anyone who has an opposing viewpoint is to be eliminated, canceled, eradicated, and so forth. This is common boilerplate stuff in Marxist or communist nations. For instance, Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution. They took out all of the educated class in China and killed them all. The estimates are between 30 and 50 million people died under Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution, and it pushed the country into famine, into extreme poverty. And so the Cultural Revolution was not a good thing for the Chinese people. It's totalitarian in nature, okay? And kind of how you see that play out in America today is you use structures and forms at your disposal to try to get people canceled, eliminated. And if that doesn't work, then you assassinate them. If you make a decision that may not be approved by this group, then you have a right to riot, protest, and destroy things. Just recently, there was this, everybody agreed, 78 million people voted that illegal immigration was a huge problem. Much of what we're experiencing today in the housing market is an issue of supply and demand. Well, when you bring in 10, 15 million people and you're only building 700,000 new units a year, the demand goes way up. And so that inflates all the prices. And then you have the government coming in and paying for all of these places. That drives the cost of housing up. These are basic economic principles, okay? And so, but what happened is ICE says, okay, we're going to go after all these people that are criminals. And the vast majority, 80% of the people that are being arrested and deported immediately are criminals. They're finding these people because they have crimes they've committed. And so we have warrants out for their arrests. Well, LA wants to be a sanctuary city where basically it's if you're an illegal immigrant and you commit a crime, you get a free pass. And so there were organized riots against ICE activities just, last summer, right? Just recently, ICE facility was shot up, and people were killed because of it. Prior to this, when Roe v. Wade was overturned, which was only, 4 or 5 years ago, it's really important to understand is that according to the Family Research Council, 1,384 acts of hostility occurred against churches. In 2024, there were 415 acts of violence or vandalism against churches. 55 of them were arson. They were firebombed. And so I think it's safe to say that there is a specific ideology. It is being funded by groups that are trying to remain secret, right? And I think it's safe to say that this ideology, when you really drill down on it, is a movement of people that seeks to harm you, particularly Christian people, and in Charlie's case, ultimately kill you. So I don't think there's anything wrong or weird pointing this out. It's just a fact, is that this ideology produces these results. And so now I want to address this whataboutism type thing. And that is that whenever you bring up something, people always say, well, what about this? You had this crazy guy go into a church, a black church in Georgia, at a Bible study and shoot those people. Yes, he was crazy. He was saying, the question you have to ask yourself is, what ideology did he have that produced that result? And what I think is really important to understand is that I ask a simple question. Is it because of or in spite of? When somebody does something wrong and they're influenced by an ideology, or they say, I did it because of this, I ask myself, well, is that what the ideology teaches, right? Is it because of or in spite of? When a Christian person, which you're going to be hard pressed to really find someone who went out and said, I was reading my Bible and praying, and the Lord told me to firebomb, a Planned Parenthood site. I mean, that just doesn't happen. Back in the 80s, they had these protests where they would sit in front and chain themselves together, but that was about as crazy as it got. And so you have to ask yourself, if someone were to do that, are they doing it because of the ideology, Christianity, or in spite of it? Are they acting contrary to it? It's very important. So when this was really difficult, when Islamic radicals commit acts of terrorism, are they doing it because of what the Quran teaches or in spite of it? And that's what's really tough, because when you read the Quran, and I've gone over this before, there's hundreds of references, not only in the Quran, but in the Hadith, the musings of Muhammad, about killing the infidel and those people who refuse to submit to Islam. I mean, it talks about cutting their necks, stabbing them in the necks, chopping their heads off. I mean, it goes on and on and on. You can't find a single verse in the New Testament, a single word out of the mouth of Jesus that says, go and cut the head off your enemy or those people who won't follow me. It just never happens. As a matter of fact, Jesus said the opposite. He says, know how you're going to know people know you follow me? Because of your love for one another. So I think it's safe to say that when people do bad things, you ask a great question, and that is this because of their ideology or in spite of their ideology? And unfortunately, I think you have to say that this cultural Marxist totalitarian ideology that is becoming prevalent in our culture, which we often label as woke, produces violence because that is the point of their ideology. And that is, if you don't accept and affirm what they want you to accept, the notion of live and let live, be tolerant, is not a value in their ideology. It's the exact opposite. Another example of this is Black Lives Matter. I mean, what's really interesting, it starts off saying, well, Black Lives Matter. Well, of course they do. Black Lives Matter, Asian lives matter, Indian lives matter, Scottish lives matter. Across the board, all lives matter to God. But every life has been tainted by sin, and we are controlled by sin. We are influenced by sin. We're manipulated by sin unless we deal with it. And we have to take this cancer out of our soul, out of our heart, and out of our mind. And you do that by embracing Jesus Christ and asking his blood to cover your sin and set you free from the law of sin and death so that you can be freed. So this is why it's called being born again. This is why it's called, a new creation, a new life. It's more than just a second chance. It's a whole new life. So I think it's safe to say that what people who are really devoted to Christ, the more devoted to Christ you get, the more caring and charitable and loving you get. And by the way, this is going to sound really radical. That's why a lot of people in the warrior class, I think, are reluctant to get really, really deep in their faith because they feel it's going to hinder them doing what they need to do to defend America. And I'd just like to say that if you really want to do a deep dive on people who have fought for this country and who are strong Christians, didn't have any problem taking up arms against the Nazi regime and taking the life of people who supported that ideology. They didn't have any problem with that. So I think it's important that if you're going to think for yourself, don't listen to the surface level arguments. You got to go deep and you got to resolve this stuff for yourself. So with all that being said, I think now we understand what this ideology is. Now, how big of a movement is, I don't know. How many people are a part of it? I don't know. All I know is, Antifa's a part of it. They call themselves anti-fascists, and they're running around and doing all kinds of crazy things out there. But the second thing is now that we know what this ideology is, we don't know how big it is the ideology more like the Roman Empire in the first century? Is it more like the Islamic caliphates or the movements in the 6th, 7th, and 8th century? This is a critical question to ask, and you need to draw a distinction. You need to think it through. And the reason why, how you do this is you take all the evidence and you make a decision. Because if you don't, you're not going to respond in a way that reflects a Christian frame of reference. So it's important to say, okay, is this more like the first 300 years of the church, or is this more like the Crusade and Renaissance period of the church? Which is it? Well, we have two historical examples of whether it's more like Rome or more like the Islamic caliphates. In the first 300 years of the church, being a Christian was illegal, right? The primary accusation against Christians is they were atheists. And basically what they would do is, the way they would kind of find you out is they'd come up and say, well, will you worship the Roman emperor? Will you worship Caesar? It could be Titus Vespasian. It could be, Trajan. It could be Diocletian, Domitian. It didn't matter. It'd say, well, you need to worship because ever since Julius Caesar, right, I think he died 46 BC, so 46 years before Christ was born. What he did is he basically took the Roman Empire away from actually a representative republic, or a democracy, a basic parliamentary democracy, maybe. And he turned it into a dictatorship, right? And he got killed for his trouble. But after that, all you see is these Roman emperors that acted more like kings or monarchs, right? But in the way they reinforced their rule is they basically said that the Caesar, the ruler, was a demigod. He was a god like all the hundreds of other gods out there. So if you were a pagan and you worship all the Greek gods in Rome, throwing the Caesar in there at the time, it was no big deal. But it was for Christians because, first of all, they were monotheists, and second of all, they wouldn't worship the Roman emperor. So they were called atheists. Isn't that interesting? So they called them atheists, and that's predominantly how they they'd say, well, would you renounce Jesus? And they'd say no, and they would be martyred for it. Now, it's really important to note, though, that during this period, even though it was illegal to be a Christian, the Roman Empire was actually built on an economic model of tolerance. So what they would do is they would go in, they would conquer a land, or a region or a nation, and then they would say, look, we're going to stay out of your political stuff. You can have your own rulers. You just got to pay the taxes. Right? So you can have your own religion, do whatever you want, but you got to pay the taxes. You got to pay the taxes. And so that's what they did is they would basically exact and give you all this tolerance and freedom to do whatever you want as long as you're paying the taxes. And that's how Rome became massive, is because there was tremendous, in a way, diversity of religions and things like that throughout it. But as long as you were paying taxes and as long as you were being loyal to Rome, you were fine. So do you see the tension here? Is that, well, it's illegal to be a Christian, but we also have a lot of tolerance for alternative religious beliefs. And so what happened is, over time, the Roman Empire, predominantly after it collapsed, and then it became Byzantium, which is a whole nother historical discussion, is Western Rome collapsed, is it wasn't really Christianized until after that. I mean, when Constantinople made Christianity the state religion in 324 AD, only 5% of the Roman Empire was Christian. And then the eastern portion was much more Christian, and he moved to Constantinople, the seat of government, and then that became the Byzantine Empire. And then in the 400s, the Western Rome collapsed, right? Alec the Barbarian, the Visigoths, and the Vandals, and all those groups came down, and it kind of collapsed, and then it balkanized into all its separations. And so that's when it started to become more and more Christian, because the Roman Catholic Church was the only thing that was kind of holding things together in any way, shape, or form. Now, what's really interesting, though, is in the 7th century, Islam bursts on the scene. As an ideology, it was designed to conquer by eradicating any and all alternative ideologies. As a matter of fact, that's exactly what he did in Medina. And then when he went back to Mecca, that's what he did, is he consolidated the ideology into one. And if you didn't agree with it, you were done. So predominantly, many people believe, as I do, is that it was 100% designed to eradicate Judaism and Christianity, because in the Quran, well, not in the Quran, but in the Hadith, it actually teaches that, well, you can be a person of the book if you pay a jizya, which is an extra tax, right? They would allow that. But what's really interesting is today, there's this thing called the Islamic dilemma. And boy, it's really taken the world by storm. And I'll talk about that on another day, because it's really interesting, because it takes the Quran, and the Quran, through the words of Muhammad, basically says that Christians are right, and therefore Islam by default has to be wrong. And boy, it is a dilemma, let me tell you. But that's for another time. The ideology, though, was designed to eradicate any and all beliefs. So if there was any idolatry, any paganism, that was just, they lopped your head off. There was just no tolerance to that. If you were a Jew or a Christian, they would allow you, they called you a person of the book, to pay a jizya tax and continue to exist. But it didn't work, and it didn't last. This ideology, I call it a religion, you call it a religion, was designed to get rid of alternative beliefs and bring everybody, the whole world, this is the mission, under the submission of Allah. Everybody's supposed to be a Muslim. And that's exactly what it did. All of North Africa, from Morocco all the way to Cairo, Egypt, was the center of Christianity, the bulwark of Christianity, for almost 1,000 years. And then it was completely and unequivocally wiped out by Islam. Today, you cannot find any remains, let alone any communities of Christianity in North Africa. They've just been all wiped out. And now they're going across the Sahara, and they're pushing down into more Christian areas like Nigeria in particular. And no one ever hears about this, but over 100,000 Christian people in Nigeria and the close proximity nations have been genocidally wiped out by the Fulani herdsmen. And no one talks about that. I mean, you don't have any of these people at the UN standing up saying we need to give these Christians their own nation. I mean, it's just the hypocrisy is off the freaking charts. Sorry, that's a little salty. The point here is simple. The only time that these ideologies were stopped from advancing is when Christians picked up arms and stood against the advance. You have this in Spain when Islam came across the Strait of Gibraltar and conquered Spain. There was a thing called the Reconquista, or they reconquered it, and it was driven by Christians who picked up and took up arms because of the oppression of the Muslim leaders. The other time that it was stopped is when the Ottoman Empire in 1500s started marching a massive army towards, they wanted to march to Rome. They were going to march due west and then down the leg of Italy and conquer Rome. But to do that, they had to conquer Vienna first because it was kind of on the way. And so it was in Vienna that their army was defeated. And it was defeated by a Polish king by the name of Sobieski. And he says that in the night, he had a dream that the Muslims were coming to attack and destroy Christianity, and that he was to go and defend the faith. And so he marched his army down there to Vienna, and it was there that he defeated the Muslims. And so these are historical facts. And so you have to ask yourself the question, is the response to be like Rome, where you don't have any power, any authority, any ability to fight back, and so through the blood of the martyrs, you change? Or is your nation of Christians grown so much that when an outside element or an inside element comes in to seek harm and destroy Christians, are you, as a Christian follower of Jesus, called to protect the widow and the orphan? Are you required to protect the weak from being massacred or in totalitarianism taken over by these other groups of people? That's why the assassination of Charlie Kirk is so important, because it's forcing us to ask this question. What do we do? Well, I think on an individual level, first we should follow the example set by Charlie Kirk's wife, Erica. As an individual follower of Christ, we should forgive the person who committed this evil act. And you can do that without lessening the heinous aspect of the act. I taught forgiveness many, many times before. Forgiving someone does not include absolving them from any consequence or justice from their decision. The main reason we forgive is that it allows us to move forward with a clear mind, with intentionality and determination and focus to build and protect rather than seek some kind of passionate revenge. Secondly, we need to recognize that the nature of this ideology and the threat that it poses to Christianity. Without a doubt, the intent is to go after Christianity. The transgender ideology has produced people who seek to do violence against Christians. This situation, as I talked about, earlier in Minnesota, where they attacked Christian school, the one in Tennessee, and the list just keep going on and on and on. We can get into those, but I'll let you do the research yourself. If you want to prove me wrong, prove me wrong. Love to see your evidence. I think you're going to have a tough time finding some. Now, this is why I do what I do, okay? You have to understand the ideology, because only then can you understand the threat. Christians can respond to threats. The key is not to overreact to a threat. You don't want to label somebody a threat who's not really a threat. You have to respond in an intentional, rational manner that builds and strengthens society, not tear it down. If we respond in anger and hatred, then we end up losing ourselves in the process. G.K. Chesterton said this, look, the real soldier doesn't fight because he hates what's in front of him, but because he loves what's behind him. So let's let our fight be driven by love. And that means it has to be strong, it has to be intentional, it has to be rational, and it has to be based on justice, all right? That's critical. Therefore, the weapons of our warfare are not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and principalities at this present darkness. We have to win the battle of the mind first and build defenses against the violence. How do we do this? If we don't know what the ideology thinks, the core values on which it's built, why it produces people who are willing to commit to violence against other human beings. If we don't know that, then how do we combat it? There has to be an understanding of the nature of power, how power works. And because you wield power doesn't make you a bad person. Oftentimes, the people with power are those who are designed to protect and defend the weak. I don't know about you, but I want a powerful person protecting my family and my grandkids, right? This is what Jesus talked about. He said, look, you can't plunder the strong man's house until you first go in and bind the strong men. So why not we focus on being really, really strong men who are under control and disciplined, but we have power and we know exactly how to use power in a righteous manner. But there has to be an understanding that there is, this binary choice that's being thrust in front of people that's not a choice. And that is you're either a fascist or a totalitarian. Remember what I said so many times, that it's not so much what you think, but how you think. This is a perfect example, okay? Right now, everybody on the left is screaming fascism, right? Gavin Newsom just did a press conference. He says, look, what's going on here is fascists. Senator Schiff, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, Senator Murphy, Senator Schumer. These are not people with, like me, who are nobodies. These are people with authoritative power in our representative government, and they are screaming fascism. They're calling people they disagree with Nazis, right? But their position of what they've been doing is completely totalitarian. They have been doing what they decry. Fascism is a natural result of an authoritarian structure of thinking. If you think authoritatively and control, you lean towards fascism. Totalitarianism is a natural conclusion of a socialist communist way of thinking. Therefore, you need to pick a side, but you need to pick a godly side. Fascism is not a side you want to pick. Socialism, communism is not a side you want to pick. The key is to pick the kingdom side. That is why I am a patriot. I'm going to leave it there for you today. Please think on these things. Let's dig a little bit deeper and let's keep this conversation, because I want to learn how to respond to these things with strength, with love, with intentionality that builds and it stops the violence that we are having to deal with on a daily basis now. Until then, what you believe is one of the most important things about you.